I have a more broad question as it is the first question. I was just wondering, what do you think the critical factor that contributed to the deterioration of the US-China relations, considering that under the Obama administration, the US was welcoming China as the new superpower to share sort of the US's sole responsibility in terms of environmental factors and such. But now with Trump and COVID, the economic, political, social relationship between two countries have deteriorated quite a bit. Yes, I was just wondering what the panel thinks is the biggest factor that contributed to that relationship.
It's a very good question. The way I see it, and the drivers in Washington, D.C., this hard line came from Washington, emerged in 2017 and 2018. And the main driver was what I was trying to talk about in my presentation, was this sense of threat, this sense of urgency. That was never there before. But there were all these disagreements with China. But now China had reached a point of power through very nefarious means on the view of the United States. It had reached a point of power where it could dominate the United States. And the reaction in Congress was very strong and very uniform. Very few people talked about negotiating with China. This idea that the world has changed, which I think was raised by one of the speakers, which is a very good point, that hasn't led to the change in attitudes in the Congress. The Congress is basically saying no one is talking about accommodating China. The mainstream is an urgent effort to counter China. And that is a powerful driver. And so why is that? China is much more powerful. Now we know, and we didn't know before, but these points were not discussed very much by senior government officials. And now these things have been disclosed in various ways. So we said that point after point where China is challenging the United States. And this is all over the world in all sorts of issues. So these things coming together lead to a great sense of urgency. That's the point I'm trying to make. And this sense of urgency is what drives the policy in the direction where it's been going. And it's held by Democrats and Republicans. This is nonpartisan. So that has been the tipping point.
Thank you, five professors, for your wonderful presentations. They were very insightful, and it was very nice to look at the various perspectives of how this issue of the Biden administration could be approached. So from what many of you have explained, I thought that the Biden administration would take a different approach from what the Trump administration took. So there could be cooperation as well as conflict and competition. But given China's tendency to link political and economic and cultural issues to create a China-centered nationalistic ideology in its own domestic realm, I thought it would be very rational to question the possibility of such a strategy. So under the current liberal world order, states have refrained from explicitly connecting problems of diverse character, but Chinese behavior has shown that as a one-party authoritarian state, it refuses to accept the liberal order as it is. So, and there are also aspects such as US domestic policy, such as the aspects that Professor Sutter has raised. So in these sorts of contexts, how do you assess the possibility of this sort of US approach?
I'm not optimistic about a moderate trend in US relations with China. The mix of the various factors to me, don't suggest that very much at all. It suggests a continuing difficult relations with China. And the big factor here is China, its behavior. Where will they change their position? Where will they compromise? I see nothing from China in that regard, as far as compromising on all these issues that have been raised by the United States. And so Mr. Biden then would have to compromise himself without getting anything in return. And I think that's a very likely outcome. And so therefore, I'm not sure he's going to do that. I think there are a few areas where they can have common ground, like in climate change and things like that. But in the areas of China's challenge, I can enumerate all the areas where China challenges the United States and where it's seen as challenging the United States. And there are about 10 of them. So I just don't see that changing. And from the Chinese side, they're continuing to do it. So my point is that that makes me pessimistic about any sort of serious moderation in American relations with China in the near term.
I want to briefly mention what Professor Charles Kupchan at Georgetown University says. Trump is not a cause, but a symptom. This implies that Trump and Biden administration share pretty similar view on restoration on domestic politics mostly. And as Professor Sutter mentioned, that China problem already became a bipartisan issue. They also share similar view on the China as well. But the point where two administrations diverge is that President Biden do cares about multilateralism and alliances. Thus, Biden administration is highly likely not only to use existing international regimes to reform, such as WHO or WTO, but also to form a new non-binding regimes with like-minded countries, as he already issued executive order to review its own supply chain, mentioning Taiwan and South Korea to be a part. Secretary Blinken already had a Quad meeting reaffirming robust relationship, not ostensibly targeting China, but implicitly against China. China, on the other hand, is expected to pursue endogenous economic development with technological independency. As the United States and its partner in Northeast Asia try to make exclusive supply chains, China is likely to improve its domestic economy and its own technologies. This trend is clearly shown in this year's annual session of China's National People's Congress, NPC. And lastly, I think we can elaborate more on next session since it deals with Indo-Pacific strategy and CPTPP initiative. For South Korea, I know we cannot firmly decide with whom to take side, but we should join United States initiative as far as it has ostensibly non-exclusive format. Thank you.
Trump administration, the trade policy was made putting U.S. interests a top priority. We can see amendment of trade agreements and being unfavorable to the countries and putting sanctions on the fair trade states. However, I think President Biden's policy is based on a worker-based trade policy as well as home-centered commerce. And the global value chain might be changed in accordance with this policy. So what do you think about his opinion on workers' rights, the environment, and intellectual property? And as far as I know, I think we should consider first the global labor structure and changes in the trade environment in accordance with the expansion of production in the US and the supply chain policy centered on the US. Second, maintaining a strong economic partnership between the US and South Korea by participating in the US-centered supply chain restoring process, as well as eco-friendly and new technology industry and development policy. So what do you suggest to Biden administration or other Indo-Pacific countries?
Well, I know it's really hard question and I'm not an expertise, but I'll do my best to answer your questions. So I think economy and security area has intertwined it. I think high technology sector is becoming more crucial nowadays. For Biden administration, I think they can build their own supply chain, like for example, excluding China or non-like-minded countries, and they can include South Korea and Japan or Taiwan as a frontline to build its like semiconductor capabilities. As far as I know, the recent report from United States government, they say that they have to build its own semiconductor capabilities or their own AI capabilities with endogenous development. So I think they can have like two solutions. First one is building their own supply chains. It's really arguable point, but I think this might be work. And second one is by supporting their domestic R&D or domestic corporations, I think they could build their indigenous capabilities as well.
I want to ask all the panels and the professors about what actions for Northeast Asian countries should come up, because Secretary Blinken, upon his visit to Asian countries this week, when he was asked the role of U.S. to mediate between ROK and Japan, he spoke that there are many commonness between two countries and we could start working from that. However, I thought that was really vague because he mentions about promoting democratic and liberal values, but I wonder how crucial would this be for facilitating trade in the Indo-Pacific? And I know it's a vague term, so I wonder how actual cooperation can be put into realization and consolidation. And although I do recognize that there are more concrete solutions like Tadong and Sang-Hyun said, like about climate change and digital trade and making global and regional supply chains more secure as a start. But like beforehand, how does the democratic and liberal values could relate to the alliance between ROK and Japan and US? How crucial would this be to the economic process in the Indo-Pacific region?
Yeah, I can talk quickly about the role of democratic values. So the United States has a number of initiatives for supporting either democratic transition or emerging democracies in Southeast Asia and other countries that fall under the banner of free and open Indo-Pacific, so the Pacific Islands as well. The United States has funds available and other forms of support available to firms in facilitating or carrying out democratic procedures such as elections. There's definitely room for collaboration between the United States and Japan as part of free and open Indo-Pacific and the ROK's New Southern policy in providing added stability through carrying out democratic principles in these countries. So that's one thing to look for.
I mean, I agree. You were talking about creating a coalition based on democratic principles or the role of liberal democratic values. I certainly think that this is going to be an objective of the Biden administration, try to encourage democratic countries to work together and try to create a counterbalance to China and to China's, political and economic influence. And I think it's one of the reasons you hear, emphasis not only on Japan and South Korea, but also on Australia and India and other countries in the region that can, potentially serve as a counterbalance. I would say, though, you're right that in the case of Japan and South Korea, they have a common set of political values, but encouraging them to cooperate has been very, very difficult. I think most American presidential administrations have been very reluctant to get too involved in the conflict between South Korea and Japan. I think Japan's revisionist nationalism really puts the Biden administration in a tough spot because it makes it more difficult to argue that the most important common set of values in Asia is liberal democracy. I think what makes it challenging is that the US often told South Korea, you need to focus on security and subordinate the historical issues to the security issues. But I think for many South Korean officials, it's really hard to take these two issues separately. The historical issues and the security issues are very deeply interconnected. I think in the past, Biden has actually tried to discourage Abe from visiting Yasukuni, and there was some understanding. But then Abe went and visited anyway, and Biden felt embarrassed. So I think Biden knows that this is going to potentially embarrass the United States and put it in a difficult position. But it's sort of the problem that no one in the US government really knows what to do with or how to talk about. I think that's probably what we'll see going forward.
In my opinion, Korea should join the CPTPP quite quickly just to reduce any lost opportunities. Korea has very heavy dependence on trade on China. Joining the CPTPP and diversifying its trade partners could act as a safety net in case of linking with the US and deteriorating relationship with China, the fact that there wouldn't be that much side effect in joining the CPTPP since Korea has already like FTAs with most of the countries in the agreement. I think it'll be beneficial for Korea. In terms of US, I think the US should be precautious, very careful considering the delicate situation domestically with COVID and stuff like that. It is true that US and its allies in the region benefit from a more open China and facilitating the maintenance of the existing economic order and the Western liberal order. And there will be benefits in increasing access to the vast Chinese market of 1.4 billion people, COVID vaccine rollout, and with the Biden administration setting the July 4th sort of goal to get people vaccinated, I think they have a lot on their plates right now. And domestically, there's consistent backlashes against opening up the country and economic globalization in general from the Rust Belt states, because they think that it's taking the jobs away from American hands. Lastly, another reason to be careful in joining, the US already backed out of TPP, and backing out of CPTPP again might harm the US reputation and credibility in the region.
So this week we saw Secretary of State Blinken and Secretary of Defense Austin's trip to Korea, and out of this meeting we're able to kind of glean some of South Korea's perspective on joining the Quad, which I think is an important component of what cooperation between the ROK and the US will look like in the Indo-Pacific. And during this trip, Foreign Minister Chung of South Korea reported that the question of ROK joining the Quad did not come up. Instead, they discussed ways to coordinate on the new Southern policy and the Freedom of Indo-Pacific strategy. Foreign Minister Chung was quoted saying that the Korean government's position is that if it conforms with the national interest of Korea and transparency and inclusiveness is ensured, we can join any regional cooperative body. I think it's important to note here why South Korea is reluctant to formally join the Quad and how joining the Quad may not conform with its national interests. And the reason for this is that the RK has chosen to abstain from Freedom of Indo-Pacific strategy for a few reasons. The first being to diversify its policy options between the US and China dichotomy. It's a false choice, and the RK is rightly distancing itself from that. Two, of course, the enormous trade opportunities presented in Southeast Asia. And three, for the ROK to have the opportunity to selectively cooperate with its allies in the Freedom of Open Indo-Pacific strategy while maintaining its diplomatic autonomy. As I see it, the ROK is acutely aware of the reality that China sees the US strategy as a containment policy, and if the ROK were to explicitly adopt it, there'd be a strain in ROK-China relations. And this threat of economic coercion, as Dr. Brzezinski brought up the THAAD incident, this has the effect of urging the ROK to diversify its economic political strategies rather than simply pushing Seoul closer to Washington. However, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't expect greater cooperation, as the new Southern policy and Freedom of Indo-Pacific strategy do share some considerable overlap, which we talked about previously with supporting democratic values, but also with regard to clean energy initiatives, infrastructure development, digital economy issues, climate change, and so on. However, there's a lack of security overlap. New Southern policy is noticeably lacking such security initiatives, so there's room for collaboration, but it will be intermittent and will explicitly avoid security cooperation as far as I see it.
The US will try to utilize the Quad as a way to diversify their supply chains and also respond to COVID-19. But ostensibly try to pressure the Chinese economy at the same time multilaterally. Policies like administration's tactics related to semiconductors and batteries will continue, and especially targeting products that China has the biggest control with or willing to take control of. I think one example could be the rare earth minerals. Currently, Australia and China are having their trade wars related to rare materials, and now China stated that they're going to restrict export of rare earth minerals to the US as well. Since China has a complete monopoly on these materials, multilateral response would be effective in the US's perspective. So I think the US already signed a contract with the Australian rare material companies and started developing their rare material facilities in Texas. So I think this way of cooperation with Indo-Pacific nations is ongoing and will continue to resist Chinese monopoly on those products. And also, there is a possibility that this multilateral cooperation can be used to respond to COVID-19, especially in humanitarian aids or vaccination support, since China is also spreading its influence using their own vaccination called Sinovac. The US will also try to boost this distribution of vaccines. So utilizing this multilateral alliance can speed up their vaccination distribution, which is what most economists emphasize that as the best way to escape from this pandemic catastrophe.
Despite the remark made by Prime Minister Suga earlier in this year, stating that China being not possible to join TPP on its current regime, there is some anticipation by the Japanese analysts that China's participated, of course, with the potential economical benefits. So what I'm wondering is, besides China's possible joining the TPP, actually the RCEP fortifying the leading position of China in the region. So to what extent actually should we and how can we manage to, like Japan and South Korea, to confront China with a more like rigid stance over the issues regarding human rights, of course, and also over intellectual properties and environmental policy, etc. Especially the lack of effective environmental regulations in China is actually exerting adverse influence on its neighboring countries, that it's actually doing real harms to South Korea and Japan. Without a doubt, that the new Southern policy by the Moon government and the FOIP principles proposed since the Abe regime mentioned would initiate new multilateral relations between Japan, South Korea, and also the Asian country and India, but still it is enough to avoid China's hegemonic expansion and irreversible influences.
I'd like to touch more upon the TPP and the potential possibilities of policy approaches by the Biden administration in terms of trade. I do believe that the United States has an incentive to create a new platform, whether it be the TPP or a new platform to discuss the legal possibilities of how world trade is going to be. The United States, when accepting China into the WTO, believed that China would conform to the liberal values that the WTO and the United States has long sought for. However, China grew influence in the WTO structure and is now trying to exert more influence into the world stage using its nationalistic ideology and its economic power. So I believe that the Biden administration and the United States in general has an incentive, although there may be domestic opposition, to rejoin the TPP or create a new platform to make a new sort of momentum for creating a liberal rule-based regime for world trade. So in terms of decoupling, rather than recreating or restructuring the global value chain in terms of trade itself, there may be a possibility of decoupling of world trade regimes in which the legal structure of world trade may be decoupled into one in which China becomes a center and another in which the United States and the liberal world countries become a center. And that will pose a very big question to Korea and Japan as to whether it would be possible to participate in both structures or whether it would be beneficial to participate only in the liberal world structure. So rather than an outright decoupling of the global value chain, there may be a bigger possibility of decoupling between legal regimes.
This might be my vague personal view on what Dane just bring about the comments. And South Korea, under this kind of competitive environment and circumstances, I think it should priority to make or establish the grand strategy to break through this kind of environment. For instance, like what is our means South Korea's national interest? Moon administration is overly concentrated on like North Korean issues, and this makes a friction between United States and Korea, as shown in foreign ministers meeting. However, it's time for South Korea to look into not the tree but the forest as a whole. I think South Korea should see more a broader scene. And some argues that we are in the circumstances where both United States and China has to make a choice between them. Others argues that we can walk on the tightrope by waging security on United States and economy on China. Basically, the bottom line for both arguments, I think, is that we should first define our national interest and then move on to the actions. So such issues as they mentioned, as like joining Quad or joining CPTPP is the perfect case. And I know it is hard for me to pinpoint like what it is and how I can define it, but I believe that we as a together can break through this conundrum if we could define, and it should be priority for South Korea.
Thank you, Sang-Yeon, for sharing your opinion. And I wanted to add on to what you've mentioned about what Korea might possibly decide to do in this decoupling environment. And what I wanted to mention was that actually the Indo-Pacific initiatives might help Korea to fully realize its New Southern policy. And I wanted to mention that the New Southern policy, the idea that embodies, is not really new in our diplomatic discourse, because it's long been pointed out that our foreign policy is like too confined in the Korean Peninsula and in Northeast Asia, despite our rising global status. So the previous administrations have tried to launch similar policies aiming Southeast, but they were rather deemed secondary and could not gain much momentum because of the North Korea issue. So I thought that participating in the initiatives and deepening cooperation with the ASEAN countries might provide us promising export markets, but also they are really important diplomatic partners because they share common interests with us that we both prefer not to be deeply embroiled in the US-China strategic competition. So I thought it would be actually an opportunity for us to help us fully realize the New Southern policy. But as I believe Dane has previously mentioned, there are several challenges. The first challenge is that we need to make sure that participating in the Indo-Pacific initiatives would not be taken as a containment policy against China, because in Korea, people are very worried that participating in such initiatives might be taken as antagonism towards China. And our foreign minister has mentioned that we are reluctant to join anything that might exclude certain interests of others and something that automatically shuts out China. So I think it's a prerequisite for us to make sure that participation in the US-led international regime would not be taken as an outright antagonism towards China. And another challenge for Korea is that our security priorities and our threat perceptions diverge from those of ASEAN or India, because our interests are largely centered around the Korean Peninsula and the nuclear armed North Korea. So I thought that in order to engage in deeper security cooperation with ASEAN, we should start from certain non-traditional security issues like maritime security or energy security, or issues like freedom of navigation and overflight, where we both share common interests with ASEAN. And that might help us to deepen interactions and build trust and somehow get a larger say in Asia's security challenges overall.
I just want a very short question toward a Korean student, especially Sanyan Ham, who brought the issue. Right now, Korean is in the situation that they have to choose whether, being inside America or China. But in terms of military, there's a military base in Korea, and they even do joint military training with Japan. So I don't really think in terms of military, Korea can't be very close to China, like Japanese never do. So in which degree do you think Korea may bond to China more? Like, you mean economically or in other way?
My point was that South Korea should define what our national interest is. And I don't mean that what degree or how South Korea should take side with. So you ask about how South Korea should do with China. And then I personally think, based on robust US and ROK alliances and United States forces in Korea, and security overweight economy right now, but it doesn't mean that we cannot hold hand with China. And we all know that we have high dependency on China with trade issues. So It's hard for me to specifically mention on which degree South Korea should do. I think it's all what I can answer.
I just want to circle back to the free and open Indo-Pacific and Korea's stance, if that's okay. Instead of free and open Indo-Pacific, Moon administration proposed NAPCOR. I don't think it was mentioned yet. It's an acronym for Northeast Asia plus Community of Responsibility. It's a mouthful. It doesn't leave any room for US. It calls for functional-based cooperation among Northeast Asian states, regardless of politics. A new Nordpolitik aimed at enhancing inter-Korean reconciliation by creating synergies with BRI, a new Southern policy, as previously mentioned, focused on ASEAN and India. As one expert close to the administration admitted, on the surface, NAPCOR appears to be an inclusive concept, but the US role appeared to be relatively insignificant in the Moon government's regional strategy. So I think that reflects sort of the trauma that South Korea endured after THAAD missile defense.
I've had a question burning for the last 30 minutes for Professor Carroll. I don't see a future where this decoupling future between the US and China in terms of technology, comes to an end. This seems to be persistent. And so I'm curious about what you see as ways for the United States and Japan to cooperate on these critical technology issues, particularly semiconductors, as you mentioned previously. What do you see as some specific avenues of cooperation that could happen under the Biden administration, such as maybe, can we see a Japanese firm investing in the United States for building a semiconductor fabrication facilities or something like that? What do you see?
Thanks for your question. Yeah, that's a very good question, very specific question. Yeah, I don't have too much familiarity with the details of the semiconductor industry in Japan, other than to say that I think such an approach would definitely include not only cooperation between Japan and the United States, but also with countries like Taiwan, which is, I think, one of the largest manufacturers of semiconductors in the world. And I think that one thing that we have to keep in mind is that in recent years, Japan's overall economic strategy has shifted away from being centered around sort of state-driven or state-guided industrial policy. So that's sort of been a trend that we've witnessed, I think, since the 1990s.